This video is solely talking about the gameplay elements of Stellar Blade. As such, it's very minimal on spoilers. I've done my best to not mention anything outside of quests or characters, as I've had some plans to create potentially a separate video discussing the story in depth. There is a good chance I might make that in the future after I play through the game again on New Game Plus. If you're interested in a more analytical video about the story, you'll have to wait a little bit longer for me. I beat Stellar Blade in December. I meant to finish it in January, but similar to some other games I played, I finished it a little earlier than I'd expected. As such, this video has been long delayed. Stellar Blade on a basic level is a surprisingly quality title. The studio has been primarily known for their mobile and PC gacha third-person shooter, Goddess of Victory Nikke. Stellar Blade was the studio's first ever AAA game, their first ever console game, and their first non-freemium title. Shift Up had showcased Stellar Blade for years, originally known back in 2021 as Project Eve, a multi-platform Bayonetta-esque action game that had been planned to release for PlayStation, PC, and even Xbox. Back in its early prototype phase, Project Eve always featured a focus on Eve and her character design, particularly on her bodily features. This shouldn't have been any surprise for people who'd known about Shift Up's work leading up to the finalization of Project Eve. Shift Up as a studio has had a history of different sorts of media projects, telling stories through light novels, mobile games, and now full-fledged console action games. Sony, specifically because of the spearheading of legendary creative Shuhei Yoshida, saw Project Eve early on and heavily invested into the game. It would be fair to say that without Shuhei, the game would not exist in the state Stellar Blade exists in today. Shuhei Yoshida saw Project Eve early on in its development and was responsible for Sony swooping in and pouring a massive amount of funding into Shift Up. That huge sum of funds were the largest reason behind why Stellar Blade became so polished, aside from the high quality work from the team at Shift Up. PlayStation as a result became the game's publisher, and Project Eve went from a third-party multi-platform project to a second-party Sony-funded and published game, similar to Koei Tecmo's Nioh and Rise of the Ronin titles. Stellar Blade was directed by Hyung-Tae Kim, who was the creative force behind turning what was originally a Bayonetta clone into the version of Stellar Blade you can play at any time right now. It is due to the work that went into Stellar Blade prior to launch that can be credited largely for the quality of the title currently, and Stellar Blade is very high quality. While the title doesn't revolutionize action games, it does do a lot of innovating, and it also tries a long list of new things for the genre. Stellar Blade, unlike the works that inspired it, is not strictly a character action game. Eve controls much closer to a character from a Souls-lite. That's L-I-T-E, not like, as the game is not completely a Souls-esque title. There is a fair bit of common ground between Stellar Blade and FromSoft's Souls series of action games, but Shift Up differentiated Stellar Blade in their own way. Stellar Blade is kind of a mixture of Bayonetta-style character action with the staple elements of From Software's Dark Souls series. Eve plays slower than her counterparts and moves in a style less akin to 2B and more unlike a knight or a character from Dark Souls. In Stellar Blade, you have a decently long list of combos. You can mix and match moves from light and heavy attacks, which is typical of character action games and hack and slash titles such as Bayonetta or Devil May Cry, even Nier Automata. Eve plays very similar to Bayonetta, or more accurately, similar to 2B. Though unlike those characters where the camera is vastly pulled backwards, Stellar Blade's gameplay is much closer to Eve, being very similar to Souls games. Differentiating further from the character action games that inspired Eve, crowd control is a huge part of the game, until the end credits. It's very important to manage how many enemies are around you, unlike Bayonetta or Nier, where those games throw groups of enemies against the player to easily defeat. In Stellar Blade, fighting 2 or 3 enemies at once can prove challenging. Simply fighting against little spider enemies, who'd normally be defeated in 3 strikes, can become a struggle if there's more than 4. Another way Stellar Blade stands out is by the direct use of Estus flasks, or canteens. In Bayonetta and other character actions games, you can recover health rather easily, while in Stellar Blade you can too. There's a general focus on replenishable tumblers, which you can increase throughout the game and recover them at rest spots, which once again are a whole lot closer to Dark Souls than Devil May Cry. These rest spots save the game, allow you to upgrade Eve's skill tree, stock up on munitions, and depending on the type can potentially allow Eve to upgrade her equipment, provided the players collected the necessary material. The flow of combat in Stellar Blade is one of the game's downsides in my opinion. Sure, it's enjoyable, but there are certain issues with Eve and the control the player has over her. In contrast to character action games, Eve can't really cancel combos mid-execution, which isn't an issue if these are shorter combos, but because they're generally longer than other Souls-styled games, it can offer a bit of a challenge. Eve also can't dodge as liberally as you'd expect. There may not be a stamina bar, but the combat is still relatively slow-paced compared to the alternatives. Eve also has a few finicky features, the biggest one being a noticeable input delay between pressing left trigger to parry and the parry executing. In this game, there is a moderate issue with telegraphing enemy attacks. The only issue I had was the slowness of enemies attacking and the lagging behind Eve's parry. Stellar Blade is almost entirely focused on parry-based combat for a large amount of the runtime, and I never got over the slowness and lag present in Eve's parry move. I never died in combat because of it, but I did take multiple hits from enemies I wouldn't have in, say, Rise of the Ronin. Another personal issue I had was with the combat is the hit stun. In a character action game, if you're hit by an enemy once, you can usually block or dodge out of subsequent hits. Eve, on the other hand, can't. It slows down the gameplay, and against bosses this is no problem, but outside of boss fights and in the overworld with multiple enemies at once, it becomes a little dragging. Combat does open up significantly after the first few hours, starting quite slow. Over the course of the game, Eve gains 2 or 3 new abilities, from specials to even more special attacks, a devil trigger or limit break, and a gun mode for her drone. On her devil trigger, dubbed Tacky mode, I found myself not really using it until I encounter bosses. It does recover rather quickly, but I didn't find any real use for it outside from tanky bosses or enemies. Eve's specials though, I loved. Combat in Stellar Blade became a little bit of a slog after a while, with enemies becoming hit sponges in each new location, so having abilities I could focus skill points on to quickly defeat the small fry was a great addition. Eve has 8 special moves. I'll put the 2 I use the most on screen right now. These 2 are such a help while playing through the game. Without them, I don't think I'd have enjoyed combat in the way I did. In Eve's combat arsenal is also a drone, which she can use either as a machine gun, a homing missile launcher, a chargeable laser, or as a shotgun. The drone is not much fun to use, as it's pretty underdeveloped, without much of a reason to use it against smaller enemies, as Eve's blade does more damage, and using it against bosses is pointless too outside of when it's necessary for battle. Still, there is one moment in the game where the drone becomes frankly awesome, and because of that, the inclusion was completely worth it. Eve can also attack with aerial-based moves, which I didn't use much, if at all. She can also sneak attack from above or from the side, which I used a lot. These took out any enemy in one hit, and for what I could tell, in the Great Desert and Wasteland zones, were almost needed with how high enemy health was. The only problem I had with stealth attacks was how poorly implemented the stealth features are in this game. Enemies will just spot Eve if she's anywhere close by. There is no stealth system here. Eve cannot crouch, and there isn't even any cover to hide behind. Eve is extremely fleshed out in combat, as she is fleshed out in the design department. In the English dub, she's voiced by Rebecca Hansen, who does a fantastic job at voicing the character. Once you get past the British accents coming from Korean characters, the dub work is surprisingly high quality. Most of the design behind Eve is high quality. I'm sure you've seen the appeal to her. While I may not care about that kind of stuff in games, I did enjoy having a litany of outfits to dress her up in, even if I found a couple that I liked early on. My favorites were 4 Seconds, Destroyed Denim, and the Daily Mascot, which you can unlock early enough in the game, and is probably the one I liked the most. I had Eve wearing it a ton on my first playthrough. There were a few outfits I really liked but couldn't mesh with the coloring of, primarily the punk top, which is such a great concept ruined by all the added flair. Eve aside though, the rest of the cast looks a little rough. I played Stellar Blade on performance mode for a higher frame rate, and the game ran great. What didn't look great were basically every other character model. Eve, Tacky, Raven all look good visually, Adam and Lily too, but any of the side characters have an uncanny valley look to them. The biggest example is Kaya, who has a really cool and unique character design with some of the best character developments in the story. But her face wound up looking out of place. Her design is kind of doll-like, but looks uncanny. I'm not arguing for all characters to look exactly like the protagonist. Nothing close to that, in fact. I don't care about fanservice, but so many of the characters in Stellar Blade look weird and out of place. Clearly, Shift Up put all the effort into the main character's design and model, because even Adam and Lily look a little out of place at certain points. Compared to Eve, who has an extremely high quality scan with a uniquely designed face, she has a very high quality character design too. It led the side cast to look uncanny at different points. Take facial models for example. You probably won't be zooming into them, but most of the NPCs' faces look like those of a PS3 character. The ones who aren't are outliers in Stellar Blade. For some reason, the textures, if they aren't hidden by a mask, simply have a muddy look to them for various NPCs, even on ones who don't give out side quests and on ones who do as well. I think the issue here is that aside from the obvious fan service, Eve was the character who Shift Up focused their development on. You can see it in the story too. She's the one with the most character progression. Ignoring all of the fan service, I'm a big fan of Eve's character design, and the customization you can do in the game. Is she as interesting as Bayonetta? No, because her character design isn't justified through the story like Cereza's. Is her design as interesting as 2B? Once again, no, because 2B's design was also justified through Nier Automata's story. Eve just looks good. I like her base design with the bodysuit, along with more of the unique outfits. I didn't even use the fanservice ones because I'm not into that in games. Eve works in Stellar Blade because the game was built around her. It's just a shame the other characters don't have the same development until far further in the game. More on Eve though, she has a great character design, in my opinion at least. Her body was scanned by Jae-Eun, who's a Korean model. Shift Up used the body scan and then created a different head to go on the character. It's surprisingly interesting and really adds to Eve's unique look in the world. You can tell which character was scanned from an actor and which were modeled by the studio. I think if you take away all the fanservice elements, Stellar Blade is a very easy recommendation. If you're not interested in those elements, you can completely avoid them. There's such a variety of costumes Eve can wear that you never even notice the fanservice ones if you didn't try to. Another aspect that makes Stellar Blade a very easy recommendation is the world. Set on Earth. Is this version of Earth as good as Nier Automata's? No, as there's nowhere near as much variety in this world than Nier's. Still, the world of Stellar Blade is a highlight. The missions are linear, while after each mission opens up an open zone desert area. These desert zones were flawed, but I always enjoyed exploring them. The missions can also run long, but I enjoyed the vibes most of the time. The dreary environment of the opening mission, with the chill music and drizzling rain, was one of the best parts of the game. It immediately drew me into the world. I'd argue there's a little too much desert and a bit too much suburbia in Stellar Blade. Part of the game is in tunnels, and those parts also aren't too fun. I would have loved it if one of the open zones was in a forest that overtook a residential district, although maybe that's too much ripping off of Nier Automata than justifiable for one game. It would have added variety, but also probably would have added quite a long time to the development. You can feel a bit of the lack of development time in Stellar Blade too, as it felt like a third area is ripped out of the game. The story was rushed towards the end, and it would have been more fleshed out had there been another location to explore in between the Point of No Return and Zion. Another issue with Stellar Blade post the Point of No Return in the story is how linear it becomes after. I know this is usually an issue with all games that have these points in their story, but in Stellar Blade it lasts a lot longer. It could have had the Point of No Return set after Lily's big character moment, and it wouldn't have been noticeable whatsoever. I honestly think doing that and allowing the player to go back to Zion to do a few extra quests would have added to the story and alleviated some of the obvious rush towards the end credits. Alongside the rushed final act of Stellar Blade is the lack of any post-game content. I would have loved to have another open area to explore with the extra unlocks you gain in New Game Plus. Even the ability to return to Zion in some form and speak to the characters as Eve one final time would have been nice to have. Stellar Blade doesn't have all too many flaws aside from some gameplay issues that probably should have been patched by now. I encountered a glitch or two, but only ever in the open world doing side content. The biggest issue I have with the game is the price of the Nier collab. I know Shift Up said there'd be no microtransactions or DLC, but this feels like a worthwhile exception. My issue with it is that the DLC is pretty expensive, at least for the conversion where I live. The DLC also doesn't have any new content or extra story unlocks. I do think the Nier characters look beautiful in this game though. One other flaw of Stellar Blade I had was with the speed of Eve. In the open zones she's slow, there's no vehicle, even if in the story there was one that she probably could have used in Adam's hover bike. That's really it. This title only has the most minor of flaws that are really not worth bringing up. Combat is a little slow, and there's a little lag between the parry, but nothing hugely horrible to make the game unrecommendable. For pros to Stellar Blade, how about the whole experience? As a game, it has a lot of great vibes. The world is super chilled out. The atmosphere is incredibly calming. Oh, and the combat is phenomenal. The action is super tense. The music is extremely quality, composed partially by the Nier series composer. All of the best elements of this game are another level above high quality, with very few downsides. I really have to say, Stellar Blade is a solid title. It's by far one of the better PS5 exclusives. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of this world and these characters in the future because of it. I honestly expected Stellar Blade to have been a 7 out of 10. I was planning on writing my video based on the idea the game would have likely been decent. Turns out it was shockingly better than that. I don't think Stellar Blade is perfect, as some have said. There are real issues with the gameplay, but for a new IP from a mobile game developer, it's incredible. I haven't dived into the story here because I'll likely do that in a follow-up video depending on how this performs, but if you want to see that, let me know. I guess I wanted to be a contrarian when it came to Stellar Blade. I wanted to like it, the game wasn't cheap, but I didn't want to enjoy it as much as I did. I don't agree with a lot of the conversation that surrounded the game post-launch from all sorts of outlets and YouTube channels. In fact, I think you can blame the cultural battle over the game from much of the controversies around it. If you can ignore all of those sides, I think you can easily enjoy the game though. Stellar Blade is a quality product, and because it's a quality product, I can fully recommend you purchase it, especially if it's on sale. I don't know if I'd be able to enjoy it as much if I'd gotten it at full price. Thank you for watching this video if you watched this far. I don't know when I'm putting this video up, but if you enjoyed, you could like the video to show your support. I would love to hear any feedback if you've got any, so you could always post a comment too. Have you played Stellar Blade? What were your thoughts on it if you had? Or if you haven't, what was the reason you didn't play it? If you want to make my day, you could subscribe to my channel too. I've been putting some effort into this channel trying to grow it, and the more time passes, the better I've hopefully become. Check out the videos on screen now, and I hope you have a good day.